ladies and gentlemen. It's a traditional cliche to say that a visiting speaker needs no introduction. But sometimes cliches are, as this evening's speaker once memorably said, where the truth goes to die. David's introduction to the remarkable podcast that he founded and hosts, Talking Politics, which I guess many of you tune into regularly, is always the same. He says, "My name is David Runciman, and this is Talking Politics." It's particularly appropriate that he should be speaking here this evening because his lecture is in our series on transformations that we've been running for the year. But it's also very fitting because this event is part of the university's Festival of Ideas. And it's fitting because David's podcast is one of the most spectacular examples that I know of how to do public engagement right. Here's some statistics that might be of interest. Since 2016, that podcast has had 10.2 million listens in 165 countries. And at the moment, it's running at more than 500,000 listeners per month. That's over 500,000 a month. Everywhere I've been in the last 2 years, in this country and elsewhere, when people discover I'm from Cambridge, the question they ask is, do you know David Runciman? And when I say not only do I know him, but that he and I co-directed a research project on the implications of digital technology for democracy, then they look at me with a kind of new respect. As the man said, if you can fake eminence, you've got it made. Except, of course, that the actual quote mentions authenticity, not eminence. Of David's eminence, I think there's absolutely no room for argument. He's written a series of memorable books, most of them with striking titles. You think of, for example, The Politics of Good Intentions, or Political Hypocrisy, or The Confidence Trap, his book, his history of democracy in crisis from World War I until 2013, and now his most recent book, How Democracy Ends, which is deservedly a bestseller and was one of the most rewarding outcomes of our research project. He's consistently been a fount of striking insights and memes. Think of his use of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan as a metaphor for thinking about what it might be like to live with or perhaps under superintelligent machines. Or his amazingly revealing question, which I think one should always ask when faced with a public controversy: is this a crisis or merely a scandal? Because crises are important. They lead to change, and scandals are what happens every day, and nothing much changes ever. Now, David started Talking Politics in 2015, which shows how good his timing is, because that was the moment when a mature democracy called the UK commenced its decline into a banana republic with an ornamental monarchy. And so it's not surprising, to me anyway, that so many people turn to his books and to those long pieces of his in the London Review of Books and to the podcast for some kind of grown-up perspective on the crisis that now affects liberal democracies everywhere. If people are looking for comforting bromides from him, though, I think they're doomed to disappointment. He doesn't do bromides. Instead, what I think he's been trying to do is to persuade us to accept that nothing lasts forever. The democracy we have at the moment is middle-aged, he says. And when people get to be middle-aged, they often do daft things. Men, for example, buy powerful motorbikes, which is both exciting and dangerous. And using that metaphor, he encouraged us to think of Donald Trump as American democracy's motorbike. In those terms, I suppose, Boris Johnson is the UK's pantomime horse. But this sardonic perspective, I think, is a useful antidote to the sentimental attachment of liberal hopes or dystopian fears. And it is, I suspect, what led the historian Adam Tooze recently to characterize David's mindset as that of a gloomy realist. So can I ask you to welcome this gloomy realist to the podium, and just for the avoidance of doubt, his name is David Runciman.
So this is another cliche. I genuinely do not know how to follow that introduction. Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So John asked me to talk about some of the big themes surrounding democracy, and that's what I'm going to do. But what I want to do is to try and get away from one way in which big questions about democracy have recently been framed, and I'm partly complicit in this, so I'm also going to be trying to get away from myself here. In the age of Trump, and much more than Trump, not just Brexit, but Modi and Orban and Erdogan and Bolsonaro, and populism of the left and the right, and partisanship and division, and fake news and Russian trolls, and all the rest. The question that's often asked of our democracies is, can they survive this? So questions get raised about democratic durability, morbidity, and ultimately mortality. And a book was published last year, at the beginning of last year, a very important, influential book, not my book, called How Democracies Die, by two Harvard political scientists called Levitsky and Ziblatt. And that book is an attempt to lay out the symptoms of morbidity of democracy, a warning list, a sign of what we should look out for if we want to keep this thing alive. And as John said, I published a book at roughly the same time called How Democracy Ends. And lots of people said to me of these books, it must be very annoying to have published a book with the same title as that other slightly better selling book than your one. And I would say, with the equanimity for which academic authors are so well known, they're not the same title at all. How Democracies Die, How Democracy Ends. How could you have confused them? And I protest too much, but I think there is a difference between dying and ending. Death is, for want of a better word, terminal, and endings can be open-ended. You can't really have an open death. Endings are ambiguous. A life can contain many endings. A life can't really contain many deaths. And endings are beginnings, so that's why a life can contain many endings. And my book was trying to be more open-ended about the fate of democracy. And I've increasingly come to think that this question, it's become in some quarters a kind of obsession with democracy's survival, its ability to last, to live, not to die, is the wrong question. And if you think about it, it's not an easy question to say anything helpful about. In just the same way, if someone says to another person, am I going to die? What do you want to say to them in return? Yes, we all die in the end, or no, it's probably just a headache. And if you're worried, you should go and see a doctor. And of course, there are circumstances when you should go and see a doctor, but there are no doctors for the body politic. There are no medical professionals. Nobody actually knows. Not even Harvard professors really know what the symptoms are. So if the question is Donald Trump, not is he a motorbike, but is he a bad headache for American democracy, or is he a cancer for American democracy, or is he a shot in the arm for American democracy? I think even the people who think he's a shot in the arm also accept that he's at least a big headache as well. But if it's a choice between headache and cancer, we genuinely have no idea. No one knows. We're all guessing. I'm guessing. I've guessed a lot. But there is no science of this. So I think that question is often a distraction, and there's a better question, there's a more important question, and I think weirdly it's a neglected question, which is not, is our democracy going to die, but can our democracy really change? So this series is about transformations, and I want to talk about change. Change is a real issue for democracies, and obviously it's also a real question that people can ask of other people. Can I change? How do I change? And you don't have to ask a doctor. Sometimes a doctor is not the person to ask advice about how you change. And there is a whole range of people who might have experience, expertise, knowledge, insight into what it is to change, who are not medical professionals. The self-help industry, which is often thought to be bogus, is not bogus. There's lots of excellent advice out there about what it is for human beings to change, to fundamentally change, not to go down the same path, to become a different person. You can learn about change from novels. You can learn about change from art. And the same, I think, is true of politics. And I don't think we ask often enough of our democracies whether they are capable of fundamental change. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Try and finish a bit before 7 to leave time for questions, but we'll see how far I get. So you might say, I've called it a neglected question. And you might say, well, it's not a neglected question. it's just not a question that people ask very often, can our democracies change? Because the answer is so obvious. What are we living through now? Why are people obsessing about the possibility that this might be the end of democracy, even the death of democracy, if democracies are not capable of change? Change is all around us. Trump, Brexit. So our podcast, its original tagline was Corbyn, exclamation mark. Trump, exclamation mark. Brexit, exclamation mark. Implying that all of these things are kind of astonishing and none of us saw them coming, and we didn't. And we're living now through democratic times that just 5 years ago, people like me would have told you were impossible. So how can I get up here and say 5 years ago I would have told you that the democratic conditions of, and I'm just now talking about the UK and the US, and there are more extreme stories in other places, the democratic conditions of these two mature democracies are now unrecognizable from what I would have said was within the bounds of possibility 5 years ago. How can I say to you that, therefore, it's a meaningful question to ask, are democracies capable of change? So it's partly because I think the difference between change and death is that there are many different varieties of change. There is superficial change and there is profound change. There is lasting change. There is meaningful change. There is fake change. There is wanting to change without really changing. I think one feature, and I thought this at the time, and I wrote it at the time, and I haven't really changed my view about this. One feature of these dramatic events, so if you take Trump's election as an emblematic example, one feature of these dramatic events in recent politics is that clearly they signal among, not all voters, because not everyone voted the same way, but among a significant proportion of voters, a desire for something very different. People wanted something new. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the people who wanted something new also wanted to get rid of all of the old stuff as well. Because I think it's at least possible in politics both to want change and also to want the security and stability that comes with the familiar institutions to protect you from the consequences of that change if it goes wrong. And that there was, in the election of Trump, and actually I also think in the Brexit vote, an element of wanting change without actually wanting to change. Because I think people were aware that these were potentially risky choices to make, but the security came from knowing that fundamentally our democracies would not change and therefore would protect people from the risks of that choice if it went wrong. And that in itself is a risky thing to think. And if you look at those projects, Corbyn, Brexit, Trump, as emblems of change, it's not going well. None of them are a rip-roaring success story at the moment, partly because the established institutions are resisting, and partly because the other thing that can go wrong with political change is that people can want something different at the same time as not thinking about what would have to change in the fundamental conditions of politics to make that different thing actually sustainable. So you want a different person to win the election. You want an outcome of a vote or a choice to be the one that you think symbolizes change. But there is relatively little discussion about what it would mean for that choice to become meaningful change. And I think where we are with Brexit is a pretty clear illustration of that. It's also true that all of those projects, in signaling a desire for something new, are also signaling a desire for something old. So there's not just a reaching forward, there's a reaching back. Take back control. Make America great again. Even, and I'm not equating Corbyn with Trump at all, but even the Corbyn project, for people of my generation and above, is quite clearly a reaching back into the past for a version of social democracy that was thought to have been lost and can be recovered. And of course, you can have meaningful change by taking back control. So that could be part of the self-help. If you really want to change your life, the first thing you have to do is take back control over your choices. But that doesn't just mean voting for take back control as a slogan. It means changing the way you think about how choices that you make through electoral politics become lasting and enduring change. So I want to illustrate this not with those examples, because those examples are too political. Even saying it, I'm anxious about listing Corbyn, Brexit, Trump in the same breath. They're very, very different. So I want to take a different one. I also want to get away from the idea that this is all about, when I say it's a kind of reaching back into the past, that basically what I'm doing is saying that the change that people want is the change that's being offered by the populist right, and it's not available because actually it doesn't think about what change means. So take a completely different example. Environmental politics, and the widespread recognition that something will have to change in our democracy if we're going to tackle the challenge that climate change and everything associated with it poses for our way of life. And I think there is a general recognition that something is going to have to change in democratic politics if we are not going to bear the worst consequences of the path we're on. So one version of what that change might be now is what's getting called the Green New Deal, a radical political program that's being espoused by most of the candidates for the presidency on the Democrat side in the United States in different levels of radicalness. It's being espoused by the Labour Party here and is being paid lip service to by a range of politicians across the democratic world. The Green New Deal is being offered as the kind of change, the kind of radical change that we need. And that may well be exactly the kind of radical change that we need. But I think there's a problem with the way that it's being offered to us, because it fixates on the two things that people think democratic change means. The first of which is electing people who espouse the idea. So what the Green New Deal is something that someone who might sooner or later be elected President of the United States or Prime Minister of Great Britain or some equivalently important post has been elected on a platform offering. And the second thing that is often said is the other ingredient you then need once you get into power is political will. The will then to drive it through. So everybody, I think, has in contemporary politics a cliche that drives them absolutely mad. And my one is when people say about climate and the environmental crisis, we know what we have to do, we just have to find the political will to do it. And you hear that all the time, as though change were a question of political will. And I think there is an analogy with individuals and their lives. So the other thing that drives a lot of people mad is being told that the way that human beings can change is through willpower. And then it's often said of some epidemic or some crisis like the obesity crisis. This is said so often about the obesity crisis, as it is said about climate change. We know what we have to do. It's just with the obesity crisis, it's pinned on individuals. It's a question, everyone knows what they have to do to lose weight: eat less, exercise more. So it's a question of willpower. And that is just not true. There is overwhelming evidence that it is not true, that willpower is not sufficient. It might sometimes be necessary. I don't think it is always necessary, but it is definitely not sufficient. If you want to change, you have to change the circumstances in which you are making these choices. It is the circumstances of change that make willing the outcome possible. It is not just the act of will. And yet there's something about our democratic politics where we think the combination of getting Bernie elected President of the United States and then willing it, and it will come. And it won't. That will not be enough. But then there's a third thing in the case of the Green New Deal that is imported to make the case. And this is the reason why it's called the Green New Deal, which is that, but we did it before with the original New Deal. So the New Deal, the 1930s, the FDR New Deal, shows that it is possible to take a democratic state, and indeed this becomes a global phenomenon, a democratic system, and reorient it around a different set of values, a different understanding of how fundamental social and economic forces work, to create a different, broader infrastructure, including a new kind of state, an administrative welfare state, and to use that reorientation of politics fundamentally to change people's life prospects. So the New Deal did do that to a greater or lesser extent. So if we did it before, we can do it again. So that's the other consoling thought. It's not just Bernie plus willpower, it's Bernie plus willpower plus FDR did it. And that's taken to be sufficient. And it's not, because we are not living in the 1930s. And what matters about change are the circumstances of change, the conditions of change. And our conditions might be fundamentally different. So even if we have the president and the program and the will, the circumstances might not allow it. Now, they might. I'm not saying that this is a futile endeavor. I'm just saying that if you are going to pursue this kind of political change, it is not, I think, enough to characterize change as we overwhelmingly do, I think we increasingly do, in terms of election results, the results of important votes, the personalities of the politicians, and the things that they say that they want to do. We have to change the conditions that might make it possible for them to do what they want to do. So if you think about the original New Deal, so if you think about the politics of the 1930s, and then compare it to now, I'm going to give you 3 ways in which I think now is fundamentally different. So if you want a New Deal, massive state spending, a reorientation of the way in which the relationship of the state to the wider economy is structured through politics and lawmaking and political action, you can't just assume that we did it before we can do it again. So I'll just do these briefly, and then I want to talk about some other examples of different ways of thinking about political change. So the first big difference, it seems to me, and I write about this a lot in my book, How Democracy Ends, is it seems to me the primary characteristic of our democracies relative to the democracies that have changed in the past is that we are older. And it's harder to change when you're older, as a fact of life. So when I say older, I mean both that the institutions are older, they're more entrenched, they're more established. In many democracies, relatively speaking, less so in the United States and Britain because our institutions were already quite old in the 1930s, but in many places much more entrenched and established than they were even 50 years ago. And I'll come back to this. It's really hard to change established and successful political institutions. But we're older too. So human beings have got much older in the last 80 years, to the extent that at the time of the New Deal, the population in the United States, those over the age of 65, was roughly 5%. It was a society of young people, and it was oriented around the politics of young people. And we now live in societies where the old can outvote the young. And so there's another argument that I hate, which is the Greta Thunberg argument, which is that the reason climate politics is so divided on generational lines is that the old people who are running the show are going to be dead before the bad stuff happens that the young people are going to have to live with. And that there's a kind of inherent self-interest at work here, which is the people deciding aren't actually going to have to bear the consequences of their decisions. The implication being that we're all relatively selfish, and old people are slightly more selfish because they have less of a future. So I don't think there is any evidence for that. I think the idea that the older you get, the more selfish you get because you have fewer years ahead of you is just nonsense. There is a lot of evidence that old people care passionately about the same things that young people care about, including, for instance, education. If you poll people, there is no difference between how important people over the age of 65 think education is relative to people under the age of 25, even though the people over the age of 65, on the whole, are not planning to go back to school. But they care about the future. So it's sometimes said, well, old people voted for Brexit because they're not going to have to live with the consequences of Brexit. But families that are divided on Brexit issues are often divided between grandparents and parents who are both screaming at each other, we did it for the grandchildren. Because everybody cares about the future. They just have a different view of what the future involves and what sacrifices are worth making. If there is a difference between older and younger voters on the issue of climate change, I think it's partly a feature of human nature, which is not our inherent selfishness, but something that we all share, we all have, which is loss aversion. We are all innately more reluctant to give things up that we know relative to accepting some future value equal or greater than the thing we would have to give up, but which is new. And I think it is true that faced with the prospect of something like the Green New Deal and a radical reorientation of our economy and society over a relatively short time frame, so say the horizon is 2030, the resistance of older voters is not because they don't care about the future, But it's a consciousness that that kind of change is going to be hard. Because it is going to be hard, but it's particularly going to be hard for people who have lived a long life under other conditions. So just to take what might sound like a trivial example, human beings' relationships with cars. So my son, who is 20, so I said to him, do you not want to learn to drive? Because I thought that's what boys did when they were allowed to. And he looked at me like I was mad. Why would he want to learn to drive? What possible use would that be for him? In whatever future he imagines, whatever his relationship is going to be with automotive transportation, it either involves an Uber or a self-driving car or no cars at all. So asking him to give up driving is not a great loss. If you have lived your life with a relationship with cars, where it is an important part of how you see your ability to navigate the world, that is a much greater loss. And there will be resistance. And thinking that there won't be resistance, I think, is naive. The things that will need to happen for the Green New Deal to work is not just Bernie to get elected or Corbyn to get elected, but there will need to be behavioral change and there will need to be institutional change, because the other thing that will make it much, much harder is the fact that the institutions that we have, these established institutions, are set up to make that kind of change very difficult. I'm going to come back to this, but I think leaving out behavioral change and institutional change and prioritizing elections and willpower is leaving out the two most important things that will make the change stick. The second thing about the New Deal is that there is very little historical evidence that democracies are capable of fundamental internal reform without an external shock. So the original New Deal was triggered by the Great Depression, but that is not the whole story, because if you look at the history of the New Deal, the Great Depression triggered the first phase of it, the FDR phase, where he stabilized the American economy, he reoriented some of its priorities, he changed the capacities of the administrative state, he tried to pack the Supreme Court and failed. And then by 37, 38, he kind of ran out of steam. And the original New Deal was itself, at that point, running out of steam. It hadn't failed, but it also had not, at that point, delivered lasting change. And there is a reasonable chance that if that story played forward without the intervention of the Second World War, the inertia of the institutions would have won. The thing that made the New Deal, that changed everything, was the Second World War, which turbocharged the way that American democracy reoriented its capacity to deliver welfare and education and raise taxes and take on debt. That was the transformative event. So there's a similar story in Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, where he writes about the inherent tendency of capitalism to produce inequality, and then he writes about the capacity of democracies to reverse or at least redress that, to turn the direction of travel the other way, not to abolish inequality, but to stop it rising. And he says in the 20th century, we have seen that democracies are capable of that kind of change. And that's what we should believe in. And actually, by the end of that book, I think he almost says, we just need to find the will. And yet, if you read the story, what the story tells is these two phases. So before the First World War, in the previous Gilded Age, we're living through another one now, there was serious attempts in Europe and in the United States to turn the tide against rising inequality. And some progress was made, but it was small, it was incremental, and it didn't go very far. And then a world war intervened, and it transformed everything. And the same thing happened in the run-up to the Second World War. And if you look at the story of the way in which democratic politics manages to tackle inequality, there is a case for saying the only precondition that we have historical evidence for, where we can be pretty confident that it will be the kind of change that will endure, is it coincides with total war. And if that is true, then electing the right person and willpower is not going to cut it. We have to think about this differently. And then finally, I think there's an issue here, which is you can look at the history of democracy and say, well, the great thing about democratic politics, of which the New Deal is a good illustration, is the kind of change you get in democratic politics is adaptability. If there's one word that you can use to describe what democracies are, is they are adaptable. When the challenge comes, even if they don't foresee it, even if they don't even understand it, they will adapt to meet it. Because they will not get stuck with a failing policy. Because the politicians will be kicked out of office if they do. The great virtue of democracy is adaptability. And we should take heart from that. So we should take heart from that. But again, I think no one should equate lasting change with adaptability. And no one should think that adaptability is just one quality. So one way that you can be adaptable is to be accommodating. So when something different happens, you add it to your list of obligations. You interpret the world through a series of things that you need to deal with, and each new one you face, you find a way to take it on. There are people like that. There are adaptable people we all know who are remarkably accommodating. And in some ways, that's what democracy is too, representative democracy, our kinds of democracies. That over the last 100 years, they've been remarkably accommodating. But the thing about taking on more and more obligations is it's easier earlier on in the story than later in the story when you have fewer obligations. It's easier to create an administrative state when there is no administrative state. It is easier to create a tax state when the tax level is very low. It's easier to take on public debt when you don't have any debt. It's easier to provide welfare when you haven't been providing welfare. It's easier to provide education when you haven't thought that's one of your responsibilities. You take on more and more. That's great. And we should take on more and more. Our democracies should take on more and more. But I think it's naive to think that this is just an inexorable process of adaptability. It's also at least potentially a story of exhaustion. And that change is going to become harder and harder the more and more democratic states take on. That is not an argument for them to take on less. It's an argument for change being hard. Okay, then let me then touch on what's the other counterexample, because if the New Deal story, I think, is complicated and doesn't give us an obvious, yeah, they did it then, we can do it now, illustration, the argument that then is sometimes made is that there's another story that should give us hope that democracies are capable of fundamental change in the absence of total war and without just taking on more and more obligations. And that's the other great transformation of the 20th century, which is called, I'm not totally wedded to this word, in the same way I'm not wedded to the word populism, but it's just become the shorthand, the neoliberal transformation of the late 1970s through to now. The end of the New Deal era, the Keynesian era, that becomes the Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberal era. So democracies, Western democracies, mature democracies as they were by that point, relatively stable, they're not as stable as we might think, democracies, as they were at that point, showed that they were capable of fundamentally reorienting how they operate as we move from a Keynesian world into as the heroic version of the story would have it, a Hayekian world. And there is a heroic version of this story that people on the left now tell themselves to show that change is possible. Like, if Hayek did it, we can do it. The heroic version says that Hayek and his fellow intellectuals spent about 30 years laying the seeds for this change, the intellectual seeds for it, disseminating ideas in favor of freedom, free markets, deregulation, free flows of capital, and other things. And over time, those seeds took root. And then when the time came, when the crisis came, the great crisis of the 1970s, the crisis of Keynesianism, of stagflation, they were ready to seize their moment. And with the help of some skillful politicians who had the political will, like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and who won the necessary elections, they turned around the ship of state. They got it moving in a completely different direction. They changed how democracy worked. That's the heroic story, and you hear people say it now. So if the neoliberal experiment has now reached its crisis, this is the moment where economists who've been seeding ideas for 10, 20, 30 years about a different way of doing politics, which can now include the New Deal, Green New Deal way of doing politics, are ready to seize their moment if they can just get the politicians elected with the will. Except I think the heroic story is not true. So I think it misrepresents the neoliberal revolution. I don't think it was a heroic story. I think what happened was Keynesianism was exhausted. And if you read the accounts of it, the fundamental changes that took place before Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan even won their elections. It was, in a sense, the loss of will on the part of the Carter, and in this country, Callaghan administrations. The relative ease with which a series of ideas that had already been resisted just somehow found their way into the body politic. And I also don't think it's the case that what happened then was politicians decided we've taken on all of these obligations and now we're going to give them up. We're going to sort of dismantle this state. We're going to very explicitly say to people, enough. They never said that. Reagan never said that. Thatcher never said that. They never shrank the state. The state carried on growing. What they did was they just neglected some of those obligations. They just didn't do them. They didn't give them up. They just let them fall away. They did take some things out of democratic politics, like central banking, other forms of what had been democratic control become non-democratic control. But again, that's not changing democracy. They left the democracy intact as it was, with all of its obligations, with all its traditional devices, and they just either let some things fall away or move away, and now people want to move them back. John McDonnell wants the People's Bank of England back under democratic control. But that back and forth between accommodation and neglect, I'm not sure that that is sustainable change. So I think it's really important not necessarily to think that the heroic stories tell us that we can do it. And I don't think that's gloomy realism. I think that's just realism. So let me give a couple of other examples, and then I'll tell you what I think we should do. A couple other examples of stories that you can tell about democratic change that may or may not be helpful. So this is one that I've thought about a lot since I wrote my book, How Democracy Ends. So there's a story you can tell about particularly American and British democracy, the longest lasting ones, which is that both democracies go through cycles where they get stuck with popular dissatisfaction, a big gulf between politicians and electorates, rises of more radical and, for want of a better word, populist alternatives, even in relatively narrowly enfranchised states. And what they tend to do under these conditions where the frustration threatens to boil over and no one can see how to change the democracy is that they enfranchise more people. So there is a story of democratic change which goes roughly, every time the democracy gets stuck, the one thing you can do to unstick it is give more people the vote. So in the British story, first of all, removing religious bars, then bars on the grounds of property, eventually bars on the grounds of gender. In the American story, also removing bars, ultimately, but it took until the 1960s, bars on the grounds of race. You keep enfranchising people, and it does seem like enfranchisement is also reinvigoration. That if you allow a whole new set of people to vote, you won't necessarily immediately get dramatic change, but you will get the possibility of change. And so when I wrote my book, How Democracy Ends, I said, well, this is not a particularly cheery story because we've now enfranchised everyone. So yes, you can defend the rights of people who've been given the vote and then are having it chipped away. You can do that state by state in the United States. I mean, there's always a case for defending the votes that have been given and have become just paper rights. But actually finding new people to enfranchise, there isn't anyone left, I thought. I think I more or less wrote that. We've kind of run out. You can enfranchise prisoners. In the United States, it would be transformative to enfranchise serving felons. It's not going to happen. And then I thought, oh, there is a group of people that we could enfranchise. It suddenly literally occurred to me. Children. And so I said it. I said it on our podcast. I said it in a lecture, actually, I think it was at the Festival of Ideas, just to sort of see what people thought. And they seemed astonished. And so I said we should lower the voting age to 6. And it's been an interesting experiment in how people think about democratic change. Because I don't think it's that radical a suggestion. And I also think some of the response to it is not word for word, but meme for meme, the same as the response to votes for women 100 years ago. They'll just do what their parents say. You can't trust them. They don't own property. I think it would be great to enfranchise children. I think there are 100 reasons why we should try it. And what's the worst that could happen? Especially relative to the other things that we're doing. And yet people said to me, it's insane, it's offensive, and it's incredibly dangerous. Children, voting, what next? And I just think it's a real question. If that's the reaction to a proposal, not to elect this person or the other person, but to change one of the fundamental structures of our democracy, not in a way that actually would impact massively on people's lives, because children are not going to elect children to parliament because the adults will outvote them. But politics will come into schools and will take education more seriously. The reaction, the horrified reaction to that, in a world where we also believe that we've got 12 years to save civilization, many of us, and many of the people who believe that also are horrified by the thought of votes for children. Something is out of kilter in how we think about change. And I do ask the question, so if history tells us, here are 2 ways you could reinvigorate your democracy so that it is capable of fundamental change. You could have a total war, or you could find some people to enfranchise. And the response is, well, we don't want to do the first, and we really don't want to do the second. I then ask, well, what are you going to do? And if you're going to say, well, history tells us, no, it doesn't. It really doesn't. So you've got to do something else. Or you could just carry on, and your democracy isn't going to die, but frankly, it's not going to be functioning particularly well, and you could be stuck like this for a long time. So another possibility is constitutional change. So, okay, let's not give votes to children, but let's try and rethink not who wins elections, but the way they win elections, what they can do once they've won elections, how power is distributed, the role of money and influence in our politics, the ways in which our politics is structured so that accountability follows particular chains. Let's change the wiring. Let's change the constitution. Well, we don't have a constitution. We could have one. That would be a start. So if you look, I looked this morning at Bernie Sanders's, I'm not trying to attack him. I think it would be really exciting if he became president. It would be very interesting. If you look at his website, the Our Revolution website, so he lists the 16 things that he wants to do if he becomes president. I think it's 16. And this would be really dramatic change from Medicare for all through to the abolition of student debt. I mean, there's 2 for starters, and there are another 14. I mean, it would be completely transformative. The one near the bottom, I think it's called something like Our Democracy, and it says, actually, we won't be able to do any of these other things unless we change the Constitution, because of the role of money in politics, because of the structure of American political life, what used to be proudly called the separation of powers and is now called gridlock. If we actually want to get this done, we are going to have to change the Constitution. And it says, more or less, I'm slightly caricaturing it here, but it says, and that's going to be the hardest one of all. And actually, that's probably going to be the slowest. It's really hard to change the US Constitution. It hasn't been done for a long time. We're going to have to build a movement. We're going to have to do it state by state because we've got to capture state legislatures. And states do not change hands much these days. It's going to be slow, hard, painful drilling through boards. He doesn't say that. But then you think about it, then the whole thing doesn't make sense. So you can't say, here are the 15 things that we want to do or the 13 things that we want to do. And here's the last one, which is the hardest and the slowest. But until we've done that one, we can't do the others. But there is an attraction to the idea that, well, we can do the others if we just will it. But it won't happen. It will be a futile endeavor. Now, I'm not saying you can't change the Constitution. Of course you can. But there is a danger of thinking, it's the hard one, we'll park it, and we'll go for the others with our willpower and our movement. And we'll see. And I'm not saying it won't work. But you really have to think seriously about whether it will work. So Thomas Jefferson famously said that the United States Constitution should be rewritten every generation. And that was his precondition for a successful, thriving democracy. And that now seems like a very quaint idea, the idea of rewriting it every generation. It's not going to happen. And it's also quaint because Jefferson assumed in the time where he lived that basically there were 2 generations. There were the young people and the older people being over about 40. And the younger people come in and the older people move off. And when the new younger people come in, they rewrite the constitution for them because they are now the state. And the older people are moving away. So that's not true anymore either. So we now live in societies, there aren't 2 generations, there are 4 or 5. And the older people don't disappear, they just get older. This is one of the great wonders of our societies, that people live so long and they are so healthy, relatively speaking, and they have fewer and fewer children. In a 4-generation, 5-generation society, political change is going to be really, really hard. So what do I think we should do? So I'm going to do this in 10 minutes, is that all right? And then I suspect John's going to say there's no time for questions. So what do I think we should do? So I just got 2 sort of phrases for this, and you might think that this is a bit glib and superficial, in which case I apologize, but I just want to contrast in very general terms what I've been talking about with the alternative. So the first thing is that I think the thing that we don't do in democratic politics, though we talk about change and we want change and we desire change and we hanker for change, is we don't actually experiment with change. So there's actually very, very little, particularly at the national level, experimentation in our democracy. We don't try new stuff. What we do is we try and elect people that we think will deliver, who we think will deliver change, not as an experiment. I know it's sometimes called the Corbyn experiment or the Trump experiment. It's not an experiment for the people who want it to happen. It's the truth. We don't experiment, particularly at the institutional level, with new ways of doing politics. And there are so many things we could do. Citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy, radically different kinds of local democracy, workplace democracy, international democracy. There are so many things we could do, and we don't do them because we haven't changed much in the last 50 years. We could experiment rather than accommodating. We could try things and let them fail. We shouldn't assume that everything has to work. And we really don't do that. And we really should. The referendum was not an experiment, the Brexit referendum. It's now quite a useful experiment. So I sat on a commission that looked at how we should do referendums in future, and it contained everyone from Dominic Grieve to Gisela Stewart, who ran the Vote Leave campaign, people from the SNP, people from Northern Ireland, every political view under the sun. And there was really one thing that we all agreed on, which is now at least we have a great template of how not to run a referendum. Everyone agreed on that. So we could, but we don't think of these things as experiment. We think of them as the agents of the change that we want. So we could experiment, not accumulate. And I think we could disaggregate. That is, there's also this tendency to think that our democracies, this is the life and death question, our democracies either are the thing that we have come to know and love, or they are going to fail. And that anything that goes wrong could cascade through, could infect the system, might turn out to be the cancer. And there is across the board this kind of small c conservatism that the risk that we run with political experimentation is that this carefully calibrated thing unravels. Whereas I think it would be good if it did unravel a bit. And that we are willing in some areas of our lives to have less democracy, so that in other areas of our lives we have more democracy. So again, I'll give one example that John's familiar with, and I think it's a powerful example, and it comes from a book by someone called Philip Howard called Pax Technica, which is about what's going to replace Pax Americana, which is the Internet of Things. The machines are going to be the new guarantors of the peace. And it's a book that is simultaneously dystopian and utopian. But one of the utopian bits is where he says, let's just accept it now. There will not be democratic control of the architecture of the internet, the basic wiring. That is not something that is fit for democratic control. It is too technical. That will, in the end, always be decided by engineers. Now, we may find new ways of exercising oversight over them, but frankly, we are not going to vote for the people who will do the wiring. And when those people try and confront the people who are running the show, it's just embarrassing. And yet, a well-run, non-democratic internet that is globally coherent and organized through non-democratic international organizations could radically empower our lives in a democratic direction. So a well-run internet could be the space of much, much more democracy at the local level, in where we live and how we live and who we are. So that's a kind of disaggregation that you almost never hear as a viable future for democracy, because it's thought you either have the democratic package or you have death. It's democracy or authoritarianism. It's democracy or fascism. And it's not. It's this democracy or 100 other different democracies that we could do, but we don't try anymore because we think this democracy is the only one we can have, because it's the only one we know. And we could have 100 different democracies, but not just by electing people under this system. And there is obviously an inherent structural flaw with democracy, which is that the people who have the power to change the system are the people who've just won under the system that you need to change. So why does the Electoral College never get abolished? Because the person who's just won the presidency has won it through the Electoral College. And it's not quite as simple as that, but there is clearly a structural problem. Unless we disaggregate it, unless we carve some bits off, we're never going to change it. Last thing I'm going to say, what then are the rivals to democracy in the world at the moment? So I'm just going to do this in very kind of emblematic, cartoonish terms. Let's say there are two rivals to democracy. By democracy, I'm talking about Western democracy, but I don't just mean Western democracy. I mean this form of representative democracy, constitutional democracy around the world, but primarily still identified with the West, and particularly with countries like the United States. What are the alternatives? So there are two, China and Facebook. So the future could be China, not democracy, or the future could be Facebook, not democracy. What can you say about China and Facebook? Both of them are really good at experimentation. So they are running experiments all the time about social conditions, about people's behavioral responses, about institutional structures. I mean, Facebook is the opposite of a Western democracy. It's an experiment machine. But the Chinese political system is too much, much better at experimentation than Western democracies. Second, they're both really good at disaggregating. So Facebook can buy something and give it up, but the Chinese state too does not think it has to be the whole package. What goes on here does not necessarily mean that what goes on over here is doomed. So both those systems are better than democracies at experimentation and disaggregation. But the thing I think that those systems can't do is change. So I don't think Facebook is capable of change because I think its business model now owns it. And I don't actually believe that the Chinese political system is capable of change, the kind of radical change I'm talking about, because its political model owns it. They both have rulers for life, Mark Zuckerberg, Xi Jinping. Rulers for life, I think, are probably better at experimentation and disaggregation, but they're worse at change. And so I don't want this to be a gloomy message. The system that is capable of change is the democratic system. But it will not change if it leaves the experimentation and the disaggregation up to the non-democratic systems. The only way, democracy is not going to die, but the only way it will survive and thrive is if it learns how to change. And the one thing that we all know as human beings, you just have to read the most basic self-help literature, is that learning how to change is not just a question of willpower and making different choices. Learning how to change is learning how to change. And we have not yet done that as mature Western democracies. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much for that. I entirely agree with you about the children, by the way. But
Everyone always says that. You don't mean
so
it.
I'm a classicist, so I'm going to give you a classicist perspective. You probably know it's coming. You haven't talked about democracy once today, actually. Democracy ended in 404 BC when Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. And to an Athenian looking into the 21st century, it's very clear that we live in an oligarchy, and if you look at the US, it's quite clearly a tyranny. Okay, so just two examples, two principles of Athenian democracy. One is not elections by vote, but elections by lot, so lottery. And another principle would be rule by referendums. So we saw what our referendum caused, but my question is, how likely, possible, or desirable is a return to direct democracy, which is sort of a third possibility?
So my answer to that would be two things. First of all, that's the really gloomy message. Democracy died 2,000 plus years ago. I don't believe that that is true. It is certainly true that our democracies are nothing like that democracy. They are different, and they are capable of change in different ways. But they're also capable of sustaining much, much bigger, more lasting, more durable projects than that form of democracy. That form of democracy was the kind that dies. And I don't think that ours necessarily is. But I completely agree with you. So I hate that either-or thing, which is like, it's only real democracy if it's this and this and this. That's what I mean by disaggregation. I don't think if the House of Lords was replaced with an assembly selected by lot, suddenly we'd become a democracy. But I think it would be a great experiment. And I think it would only work as an experiment if we didn't believe, now, finally, we've returned to our roots. And this is going to be the answer to our problems. If we said, this is one thing we could do among many things we could do, it might not work. We need to be open to the possibility it might not work. But unless we think like that, what we will get is what we have now, which is essentially an unreformed political system. But I do think that there is, I mean, I completely get your point, but there's a danger to that kind of binary, which is, I mean, it's part of the, it's either this or fascism, which is, it's already tyranny. We lost it 2,000 years ago. It's not either or. If we keep thinking it's either or, either China or Facebook will win.
Thank you for a lovely address. It was really interesting. But when you mentioned about disenfranchised, I'm afraid you left out a group. And that's the group like me. I'm an EU citizen living in this country. I have been paying taxes all my life, but I have been disenfranchised of having representation.
So can I answer that question, which is, I don't think I did leave you out, because I count you among the category of people who clearly should vote, but whose rights need defending. And I don't think that's the same as that category of people whom people have never considered as being worthy of a vote. I thought you were going to say the other thing which people sometimes say, which is you've left out animals, or robots, or aliens. You know, like we can, you know, this thing can go on, but I think clearly in any democratic system there's also a quite often considerable group of people whom, under the principles of the democracy, should be voting and don't. But I think, though we may not win them, we know how to make those arguments. I think we struggle to make the argument that I'm trying to make, which is to broaden our imagination about what it might be to be entitled to vote. Obviously, there are some people, including some people in the current government, who might say that you're not entitled to vote, but it shouldn't be too hard to out-argue them. But they don't think children should have the vote.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I come from Belgium.
Yeah.
And in Belgium,
what's the voting age?
Children actually can decide whether they have euthanasia or not.
Yeah. That was not what I had in mind. Two more, yeah, that's fine.
People are often critical of the current party system, or party system in general, which produces the politicians we now have. So would it be viable to abolish parties altogether and just have individuals stand for office?
So I think this is part of the disaggregation story, which is if you look at our democracies and look at which bits are struggling most at the moment, it's conventional political parties. But there's still this feeling that we've got to hold on to the conventional party structure, because if that goes, then the whole thing will unravel. It's not at all clear to me that the whole thing will unravel. But also, I don't think we have to think that the choice is parties or individuals. There are lots of other things that might stand in between them. So we're already seeing that movements, social movements, are at least potentially a vehicle for electoral change and then possibly real change, although possibly not. And we may be at the start of that process. I completely agree with you that the idea, if you look at American democracy and British democracy, and you took someone from 100 years ago and showed them our politics now, they'd be astonished by many things, but I think the thing they would be most astonished by is that the two main parties, though they've changed their character, still have the same name. Like 100 years? 2? You didn't think it was worth trying another one just to see? You know, you never know what would happen. Structurally, it's really hard. So in this country, it's incredibly hard to get a new party off the ground. So then you have a choice. You could bash your head against that wall for 20 years like Nigel Farage and hope you get a referendum. Or you could think, it's no longer a party game and I'm going to do it some other way. You could do what Macron did in France, still hard under our system. Even within that context, there is relatively little actual attempt to experiment with something new. But I think, and I've thought for a while, that if you had to ask one fundamental question about our democracy, which is not will it survive, but is about change, it would be what will replace the political party as the organizing institution of representative democratic politics? And I have still not heard a convincing answer to that question. And yet that has to be the question. There has to be an answer. There is no way in 100 years' time it's still going to be those two parties. If it is, God help us. Should we take one more? Yeah.
So I was struck by your line that you said that people can want to change without actually wanting to change.
Yeah.
And this
That's what therapists say.
and this seems particularly the case with regards to climate change, but I guess can affect or relates to lots of different issues. So I was wondering if you had, I think this might be quite a broad question, but how can you incentivize and galvanize people, effective behavioral change and people actually changing in a democracy?
So it's a huge question. Of course, there's a lot that's being written about this and actually a lot of experiments. So there is an experimental part of our politics, which is the kind of nudge bit, the attempt to initiate behavioral change without quite telling people that that's what you're doing. And it may or may not be democratic, it may or may not be paternalistic. I don't think it can be the answer to the kind of change that I'm talking about, which involves people actually wanting to change, as well as just wanting change. I think it's really hard, but I think we've learned probably, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, that if you try and channel that impulse for change through the narrow funnel of elections, particularly national elections, including referendums, that is giving people a choice over the big questions. Who do you want to govern you? What kind of country do you want this to be, inside or outside the EU? These are real questions, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. Absolutely not saying we should abolish elections. I'm not even sure we can abolish referendums. I think we probably just need to run them better. But funneling it all through that and thinking that that will be the vehicle of change actually discourages people from thinking about the conditions of change. And I do think that there is this vice in contemporary democracy, which is waiting for the next election. That we spend all of our time, and I'm as guilty of this, and we're guilty of it on my podcast, because it's fun and it's kind of like sport. And elections are really exciting and really close, and even votes in Parliament are really close. It was quite exciting. Was it last night? Or was it a lifetime ago? Last night. But this sort of fixation on he won, she lost, she won, he lost, they won, they lost, our team won, the other team lost. It's completely understandable, it's human nature. But to see that as change, I think is a mistake. And I think we spent too long doing that. And if we want to kind of learn a lesson, I think Obama was a great president, increasingly with hindsight, a greater and greater president. And that thought that he didn't deliver the hopey, changey thing, as Sarah Palin called it, I don't think that that's true. I think he did, but his presidency was followed by the presidency of Donald Trump, which is a complete catastrophe for the Obama version of hopey, changey politics. And when he said, we zig and we zag, I didn't like that either. Because you've got to zig and zig, because otherwise you're going to lose it. And yet, the primary response to the election of Trump is wait till next time, and Elizabeth Warren wins or Bernie wins. And we could zig and zag for a long time and not actually entrench the kind of change that we need. So I don't think we should abolish elections, but I don't think we should fixate on thinking that if only we win the next one, it'll be all right. We should have learnt by now that it probably won't be.
On that cheerful note, I just want to thank you again for coming. It was brilliant. I wish we had longer. Thank you.
Thank you.